This simple parking area at Southwest 3rd and Oak in downtown Portland has pretty much looked just like this since 1955, when the ornate 1881 Ainsworth block was demolished here during a string of historic buildings coming down in Portland, mainly in the 1940s and 50s. However, had things gone a little different, and if not for the quick actions of a 47-year-old soldier, this building would have come down more than half a century sooner. February 11th, 1904, could have gone down as one of the most tragic days in the history of the City of Roses. The three-story Ainsworth block, taking up a full quarter-city block, contained lodgings on the second and third floors and multiple businesses on the ground floor. Lots of people coming and going. One of these residents was 31-year-old, recently divorced Ethel Tobin, who resided in room 18 on the third floor. She'd recently come to the city after leaving her husband and was working in the dressmaking business on the first floor of the building. Ethel had worked this business previously until she paid a visit out east to the Oregon town of Pendleton and met a much older man, 65-year-old Edmund Tobin. Upon meeting this man, more than twice her age, Ethel was apparently swept off her feet by this man's claims of being fabulously wealthy. Ethel's friends strongly warned her against getting mixed up with this man, but they also knew she would do anything to get out of the mundane existence she'd currently been living in. After a brief courtship, the two were married in March 1902, and she went home with Edmund to where he lived in the eastern Oregon town of Baker City. It seems only then did she realize the actual world she would be stuck in as a married woman. I've never been able to find a picture of Edmund Tobin, but with what information I have about the man, I dug around in some old public domain images and found some of this man, reportedly a prospector from Minnesota. I get the feeling this is kinda sorta what Edmund Tobin looked like, so I'm just gonna go with it. This is our Edmund. And Edmund wasn't a great guy. Born in Ireland in 1838, and long before Ethel came into his life, he was married to an Eliza Saylor. When he was 25 and she was still 15, she gave birth to the first of 7 children they would have between 1863 and 1878. The second oldest of these children, and the eldest son, was a Thomas Tobin, who will come back into the story later. Sometime prior to 1900, Edmund and Eliza would separate. I can only assume they actually got divorced. And what would prove to be the last straw for Ethel in their marriage were accusations that Edmund had another common-law wife living in Canada with whom he'd had 3 boys with. I found no proof of this, but Ethel's attorney looked into the matter and reportedly found verification for this. Thomas Tobin would vehemently deny this was the case, but as Edmund's son, did he really know that this wasn't possible? Or was he just another son with a willingness to side with his father? Ethel would use this common-law wife as the primary grounds for a divorce, which was granted to her in April of 1903 after the two had separated in October of the previous year. So, the divorce court also clearly believed this common-law wife existed. Beyond this, there was also the clear fact that Edmund had deceived Ethel into marriage by claiming he was rich, when, in reality, he was just an old man living out in the sticks with little more to his name than a mine that his family owned out there. Ethel found herself leading an even more dissatisfying life than she felt she had before, and after the separation, she returned to Portland and went back into dressmaking. She established employment on the first floor of the Ainsworth block, and scored a residence upstairs on the top floor. After she left town, Edmund made numerous efforts to try and get her back, never successful. She had a job and a place to live, and she didn't need a deceptive old man to come take care of her. And with each passing rejection, Edmund became more desperate. A Mrs. A.J. Pitkin, who worked with Ethel, said that as time passed, Edmund began threatening her life, saying he'd kill her before letting her be with another man. As was tragically common at this time, these types of threats were often not taken as seriously as they should have been. Right next door to where Ainsworth Block was, still stands the Lewis Building, where 21-year-old Emma Ulrich worked in 1914. The elevator operator of that building, a Fred Tronson, became obsessed with her to the point of taking her hostage inside that building at one point. Despite courts getting involved and co-workers keeping an eye on her, Emma would be ambushed and gunned down in her home that same year by Tronson, another man who couldn't handle the rejection.
Over here, this was once called, I believe, the Porter Hotel, went under a few different names. And many years ago, 1910s, there was a local actress who worked out of a place down on Morrison. And she was living here, and a guy went and saw her perform, got fixated on her, kind of lingered in the lobby for a long time, laughing and whistling, and then went upstairs and shot her dead. Her name was Alice Minthorn. Alice Gordon was her stage name. And yeah, apparently, because it was so long ago, when people went into the room, they found Alice dead and her bed was on fire because she'd been shot on the bed. And those old guns, they would spark and stuff. And yeah, it caught her bed on fire. So that's some dark history.
Early 1900s Portland is riddled with these types of cases. Without Ethel knowing, in January 1904, Edmund would come to Portland. According to his son, Thomas, he came there for medical reasons. Whatever the case, he was lurking in the very city where his former wife was now residing. This brings us to February 11th, 1904. A Mrs. C.E. Burpee, wife of the building's janitor and friend of Ethel's, was up in her room visiting her around 7 p.m. And it was then that the last person in the world she wanted to see showed up in her doorway. Edmund walked into her room, a mysterious package in his hand. Upon entering, he said to Ethel, "I want to see you on a matter of the most serious kind in this life." Ethel abruptly responded, "You can go, as I do not want anything more to do with you." Immediately after this response, Edmund pulled a .38 revolver and opened fire. Both women attempted to flee the room, Mrs. Burpee leaving first and screaming murder down the halls. But Edmund was able to fire 3 times on Ethel. But remarkably, only one of these rounds penetrated her flesh. The other 2 rounds had deflected off of the metal inside the corset she was wearing. The other round grazed her arm and entered her chest, deflecting off of a rib on the left side and stopping a couple inches from her spine. Fortunately, not a fatal wound. Despite this, under the circumstances, she was able to flee the room. Edmund did not give chase. In that moment, he realized he'd finally lost. To process this despair, he pulled up that package he'd been carrying and placed it on a table. Several people inside Ainsworth Block heard the 2 women screaming and running, 2 of which happened to be soldiers, conveniently there on the 2nd floor, a Sergeant D.L. Parsons and an Albert F. Dean. While Parsons ran to find a police officer, the city's police headquarters happened to be only a block away, Dean ran towards the screams. As he rushed down the hall towards Ethel's room, he heard one final gunshot. Approaching cautiously, he reached the room to discover Edmund Tobin dead on the floor, gunshot wound to the head, the gun laying at his side. But that wasn't all. The package Edmund had brought with him was close by and smoking as if recently set on fire. Thinking he was just putting out a small fire, Dean grabbed an umbrella in the room and beat the fire out. Officers arrived shortly after to deal with the crime scene. In their examination, they ultimately opened up this mystery package to find enough dynamite, according to explosives professionals, to severely damage the building, if not cause a collapse. A collapse that could have killed dozens of people at a minimum. While not realizing it in the moment, Dean's quick response in putting this fire out saved his own life as well as all of those potentially residing in the building at that time. Later on, a small vial that had contained carbolic acid was also found in the room. Edmund had imbibed this before his final gunshots. He was not leaving any chance of survival for himself. While no one can know for sure what his master plan was, there are two theories. One is that he had no intention of using the revolver unless necessary, but wanted to keep Ethel trapped in there under the threat of it, wherein he would blow them up together. The more readily accepted theory was that he went there with the plans of killing Ethel if she didn't go back with him, and if this didn't work out, he would execute her and then use the dynamite to remove any evidence of what happened. If this was the case, it shows how lost this man was, that he was willing to put the lives of everyone in a building at risk just to cover up something that was going to easily be tied back to him. But, like many in Edmund's situation, all they care about is their needs and what they want, and the rest of the world around them does not matter. They're willing to take lives, especially those of people they feel have wronged them, and the most sadistic aspect of it is that they look at these bloody, violent ends as though going out in some ultimate romantic blaze of glory. I personally wholeheartedly believe in those last seconds of life that Edmund Tobin felt fully justified and that he was the victim in all of this. As a man who operated a mine, he had easy access to dynamite, and it was believed this is where he got it from. What's interesting and fortunate is that he had this box set up in such a way that he could light the paper on the package and it would go through to the fuse to set off the dynamite. But when he set the package on fire, he, presumably on accident, set it on the opposite side of the package from where the fuse was, delaying the explosion and giving Albert Dean enough time to get in there and put the fire out. A little bit of incompetence that also saved many lives. While Edmund lay there, dead on the floor of his ex-wife's room, Ethel was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital, where she had the one bullet that had penetrated removed. Within days, she was as well as she'd ever been, and the greatest nuisance in her life was no longer around. And fortunately, she had both a job and a home to return to. Thomas Tobin would come out from Chicago, where most of Edmund's family resided, to take care of his father's burial. Upon his arrival, he openly stated that he felt his father had gone insane primarily from exposure to the elements inside the mine that he maintained. He attributed this to his father going to Portland for medical treatment, at which time Edmund sent him a letter telling them that he hadn't been eating or sleeping and that he felt his body was generally giving way. Thomas blamed the actions of his father on a mania due to this exposure, as well as Edmund's ongoing worries about the state of that mine. Now, I know mine workers in the past have experienced a plethora of medical issues, mostly respiratory in nature, and this very well may have played a part in terms of Edmund not being fully of sound mind, but on the flip side, he had made numerous threats against Ethel previously, and I think, regardless, the possible effects of the mine, he had the capacity to do something horrible like this. So again, I feel this was more a son trying his best to cover up for his now deceased father. It was reported that one of the driving factors behind Edmund's actions was the shame he felt over being divorced. This was extremely common back then, not that it isn't today. Not so much because these men loved their wives dearly, but more because the world back then often looked at you as a failure as a man if you couldn't keep your wife and family together. He was heard to say that he'd never allow himself to be guilty of anything that could bring disgrace to his family. Then, he tried to kill his ex-wife and blow an entire building up. I mention the disgracing the family angle on this because when his son, Thomas, came to Portland, the decision was made to briefly bury him at Lone Fir Cemetery in southeast Portland. This was because, with it being February, the ground in Chicago was frozen and the family was going to have his body exhumed during the warmer season and sent back that way for his final burial. So, unless his family forgot or ran out of money or whatever, maybe they did feel disgraced by Edmund and his actions because, according to records, Edmund Tobin is still buried at Lone Fir to this day. Whether it's right or wrong, I personally like to think the guy's family just said, the hell with him. I was not able to find a lot of information about Ethel. I know she was born in 1872 in Michigan as Ethel Curley. Documents suggest she may have been married to someone by the last name of McInnes or McIrvin, but I am not sure what happened to her after this event. It appears even after the divorce, she was still going by the name of Tobin. I found a reference in a 1917 newspaper article to an Ethel Tobin of Portland. This may have been somebody else, but I think this was probably her. And that's about all I could find about her after these events in 1904. It's hard to say how she came out of this event, how it affected her, but the most important thing at the end of the day was that she was able to escape February 11th, 1904 with her life. And in a way, Ainsworth Block was able to do the same thing and continued to grace Portland's downtown area for another 51 years before its demolition in 1955, reducing it to what it is today. I've said it before and I'll say it again, but I wonder if those who frequent this area have any idea the wild events that happened on that street corner so many years ago.
Hey people, Steve, back at ya. I'm at 3rd and Oak, and this parking lot here, this used to be the site of the Ainsworth Block, and in 1904 there was a woman living here, and she'd been conned into marrying this guy from Eastern Oregon who said he was super rich, and then she found out he was just a deadbeat looking for a wife to, dote on him. So she left him, gonna divorce him, came here. The guy followed her here, and I apologize, his name escapes me, and he tried to blow her hotel room up, and he could have burnt the whole building down. And fortunately, one of the woman's friends ran downstairs, found a soldier in the lobby who heroically ran upstairs and stomped out the dynamite this guy had lit right before it blew the building to hell, of course. And either way, Ainsworth Block is gone now.